Howdy, and welcome to the Aggie Teach Momentum podcast, brought to you by the Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences program at Texas A&M University. I am your host, Davies, former high school physics and astronomy teacher and current program manager for Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences. This podcast is meant to provide a little more insight and information to those seeking a secondary content teacher certification in Texas. We aim to provide episodes that help pre-service educators on the path to certification, as well as leverage the experience of myself and other guest speakers to support teachers in their first few years in the classroom. Today's topic is a great one. Today's topic is Special Education 101, kind of an intro to special education for content majors. And we have a guest in the studio with us today. Please welcome Catherine Davies, who is an educational diagnostician with Bryan ISD and also a registered professional diagnostician in Texas. Thanks for joining me today.
Howdy.
So, how long have you been in Bryan ISD? Why don't you give me a lowdown of who you are and how you got to your current position?
Absolutely. So this is my second year as an education diagnostician in Bryan. I'm finishing up my 10th year as a education diagnostician. Prior to that, I was in the classroom for 4.5 years as a special education teacher at the elementary and middle school background.
Mm-hmm.
And as a diagnostician, I have helped serve districts from early childhood through 8th grade, but I have supported in other capacities with just helping grow and do professional developments.
And so that's pretty cool about special education. I know we've had a conversation off mic about this, but special ed is a lot like many other certifications out there in which that it's EC12, right? I mean, just because your kind of focus is middle school, elementary school doesn't mean that you haven't had experience and you're not knowledgeable about high school, right?
Absolutely. Education diagnostician is just like a special education teacher, where the certification is early childhood through 12th grade. So you have a little bit of knowledge and training throughout your path and curriculum to breadth the knowledge of how you're going to support students all the way through their K-12.
Awesome. And I think you forgot something in your background. You're also an Aggie, correct?
I am an Aggie, class of 2010.
There you go, class of 2010, right along with me. Okay, let's get started with our topic for today. First question is that we know that all teachers in Texas have to take at least one course involving special education, and especially if they're going through a university program, they have to know a little bit about special education in general. So in your opinion, what's missing from that course that teachers really need to know about?
What that actually looks like in their classroom and how that support gets to the student. Most of that class is all about the eligibility areas of how a kid gain services and what that may look like. But again, that's breadth of knowledge from how a kid may look when they're 4 or 3 to how a kid may look when they're 18 or 19, possibly 21. That looks very different, and how that actually looks like in the classroom is not really portrayed in that class. It's just a general knowledge. More importantly is how that partnership as a general education teacher, how do you work with your special education personnel to build that partnership to ensure that you're meeting those students' needs? And then finally, the last thing, which I think is probably the most vital for secondary teachers to know, is that the impact of child find, or finding those students who need supports and services, still exists at the middle school and high school level. We would hope that majority of the kids who have more pressing needs were identified and had started gaining services prior to them entering those higher grades, but that's not always the case. And so secondary teachers in general really need to know what child find looks like at that level and how they go about of helping get kids support when it's needed.
Yeah, it's really important because I as a former high school teacher, I probably sat in on maybe 1, 2 initial ARDs, which we'll talk about ARDs here in a little bit. But the general assumption is that by the time they make it to junior or senior year, they've all been found, right? I mean, that we don't have to worry about finding students or figuring out if a student has a disability at this point. So it's really important for a teacher to know that. From my own personal experience, the one that I can think of was actually a student who was going through the process to make sure that they had whatever they needed to go to college. So
Absolutely.
it was a process that was started to identify and get those supports in place before they moved off to college. So that way they had the paperwork already moving into it.
So that is something that you see oftentimes with juniors and seniors. If they've gone through high school and their need for supports and service hadn't manifested or shown a need greater supports in the classroom, but they know that, hey, I struggle with mental health issues. I get really stressed about testing, or I really struggle with reading comprehension when I have a large amount to read in a short amount of time, and they know those personal struggles, and so they've started talking to their colleges or prospective colleges. And so prospective colleges will send you back to the high school and say, hey, you need to have this evaluated. Let's look at this. And the only way to get an evaluation done in K-12 is through the special education department, to look at that manifest and how those look like. And so from the gen ed side of that, you have to know, do you see those struggles in your kids? And if so, how does that rise to a need of support in comparison to everyone else in your classroom, so that can be articulated in an appropriate manner to ensure that a kid moves on with the most pressing issues addressed, so that the post-secondary colleges level are able to accommodate for that kid and build that plan for them.
Yeah. And I want to jump back to something else you started with, and like what's missing out of that course, and that is the practicality nature of it, right? I mean, for someone who gets identified in elementary school or even in middle school, they're going to have supports between now or between when they're identified and when they get to potentially a high school teacher. And so someone who may have been identified with dyslexia, or someone who's may have been identified with autism, by the time they make it to you, they have learned a little bit of what their needs are in the classroom, what supports work for them, and so maybe they don't need as much help, or maybe they do still need some help. I can think of one particular student who I had early on in my career who was, I don't know if you would describe it as high-functioning autism. I mean, they had autism, but they were in an honors level physics class, and so they did not need a whole lot of support from me, but they had certain sort of quirks about them that I had to figure out how to manage in the class, and how to work with them, and how to make sure that they were being successful. But it wasn't necessarily much that I had to do other than, how do I relate with this student?
Absolutely, and that's one thing that is also missing, is that supports from special education go beyond academics. There's functional needs as well. And by functional, we mean social skills. We mean organizational skills to monitor and complete tasks on time, or how do I manage my time management. Those are things that often go unnoticed, but the general education teacher, especially at the secondary level, can be like, oh my gosh, this kid is really struggling with 8 classes and getting to class on time, or getting things turned in on time, or remembering when I have a test in this class or a test in that class. And that struggle isn't seen at the elementary level. And so sometimes you may have a kid that was identified early on and then moved to a lesser level of support from special education back to a Section 504 plan. But then in high school, that functional need becomes much more pressing, and they may need more direct support. And so being able to articulate that and know that demand is also helpful.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Like, get identified early on when the demands of the classroom may not be at the same rigor, or at the same level, or the same quantity at the elementary school level. And then you go through middle school, and then you get to high school, and the demands are just different, right? And then they need something different at that point. Now, you brought up Section 504, and that actually leads right into the next question. And that this is, I think, a common question when we have a discussion around special education is, what is the difference between what we consider special education and what do we consider underneath Section 504?
First and foremost, the Section 504 is a general education level support. So that's coming all from general education teachers. You're not going to have anybody else helping support those level of students. And it's really just a way of leveling the playing field by giving accommodations. So those are going to be simple things as like extra time. Maybe let's have reading support or access to headphones. Those sorts of things. You're not changing anything that the student is doing, and the student is not gaining any additional support or service other than what the general education teacher can give. Whereas special education in itself is an intensive level of support that is individualized for that student. So it goes beyond those required accommodations into what we refer to as specially designed instruction. And that specially designed instruction means that that kid needs something beyond that teacher, that classroom teacher. So you're going to have a dedicated individualized education plan where there's goals that are tracked with that student to help them make progress in the curriculum and then access the curriculum or school environment. Because again, we're looking at not only academics, but those social and functional skills, which are becoming more and more important.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you brought up the sort of level of support that you receive for the students with Section 504, it's squarely on the teacher. I mean, it's not to say the teacher can't get support with this, but it's squarely on the teacher to be able to do this. But it's a certain level of support. I kind of look at Section 504 as almost like glasses, right? I mean, you give them the glasses and they're able to succeed. It's a very minor sort of thing. While special education, on the other hand, requires a lot more involvement and a lot more support that you get from other places in the school.
Absolutely.
So with this new teacher going into the classroom, walk us through what sort of expectations we can have around the students in special education or 504.
At the beginning of the year, you're given a list of students, or you're identified with a 504 plan or special education paperwork. The biggest thing that you need to do is figure out a way to track those use of accommodations and goals within the classroom. And the system has to be user-friendly to you. What may work for you may not work for the teacher across the hallway. So you have to really figure out what's going to work for you, because that's what's going to help you keep that line of communication open to your special education counterparts who are helping manage and focus that student to ensure that what is in that plan, or even in the 504 plan, that the accommodations are working and are exactly what the kid needs. Again, those plans both plans are yearly plans, so what may have worked last year for the kid may not be what's most effective for this year. And so you have to track those accommodations to make sure that A, the kid's using them, or B, they're refusing them, and what is that impact? So they refuse to use them, but we're still acing the class, we have no difficulty, then maybe that accommodation is outdated and needs to be removed. Or we're refusing them and we're failing. We're not hitting the bar where we're supposed to. So what can we do differently to make that accommodation more approachable for the student to ensure they're utilizing it because they know they need it?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in real quick for the tracking. Like what worked for me, and I'm just throwing it out there, maybe it'll work for others who are listening. What worked for me was simply a spreadsheet that was broken down by period, because I looked at it as, okay, I have these students on my roster. What do these students need? And so I'm looking at the spreadsheet for first period, and I see, okay, Johnny needs notes printed out, or Susie needs extra time on the assessment that we have today. So I'm looking into every class period as I get to it and say, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing today for these students? And so tracking is really good. And from the science teacher perspective in me, tracking is data, right? And it's really what you're just talking about. That data goes back to the people involved in the student's education plan to make decisions, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So those decisions, though, get made in a particular sort of committee meeting. We call it an ARD meeting. So walk us through what sort of a general education teacher's expectations are or role is in this ARD meeting.
Absolutely. So first, I'm going to tell you what an ARD meeting stands for.
Good idea.
ARD meeting stands for admission, review, and dismissal. And so those are for kiddos that are only in special education, because we have a meeting to admit, so admission to begin services. We have annual meetings where we review those meetings each year to make sure the plan is up to par with where the student is within their own strengths and weaknesses and how they're adapting to the curriculum and the expectations within the classroom. And then the dismissal part is we have to exit them from the program. And then they go back to general education or 504, whatever they may need.
Jumping in real quick, ARD is uniquely like Texas,
Yes.
right? I mean, the ARD meeting that's what we call it here. Other places, it's called something else, right?
It's everywhere else in the United States, it's an IEP meeting, so individual education plan. So your ARD meeting, you create your individual education plan, and Texas just likes to have its own funky term, so we roll with it with another acronym.
We love to make things up in Texas, I guess. So
Yes.
Keep going. What else is in the ARD meeting?
In the ARD meeting, the general education teacher is there to represent all of the general education teachers. So you will not see 8 teachers in the meeting. You're going to have one special education teacher and one general education teacher. Unless the kid has LPAC, so they're a second language learner, and then that may have another teacher who's there to represent that piece of it. But you are there to be a meaningful part of the conversation to ensure if an accommodation is being proposed or is being accepted into a kid's plan. You want to make sure that accommodation makes sense. You can read it, you can understand it, and it's useful to the student. We have parents who sometimes like to say the kid needs everything under the sun to make the kid be the most awesome student possible. That may not be what the student needs. And so you're there to kind of help filter and kind of talk for that student of, in this particular season of life, they don't need that, and here's why.
And the here's why part is where that data comes in, right?
Correct.
A parent may be, oh, well, my student needs the test read to them. And it's like, hey, well, we keep offering and the student keeps refusing, or they're doing just fine without it. And here's the data.
Absolutely. And so that keeps you from being held accountable for something or something being put into a legal document that's not needed, which is why it's good for you gen ed teachers to be there and to be actively participating in that partnership. When it comes to goals, content level goals, if you're the math teacher, you can kind of help with the special education teacher look at all the data and make sure that we're targeting a kid's greatest weakness to ensure that they're being more successful in the math class as you move on. But also keep in mind that functional piece. If you are sitting there and you're like, he can't manage his 8 classes, we need to make sure that those classes are coming to light and you're ensuring that you're looking at what we can do differently to ensure that organizational piece is being met for the kid. But also keep in mind, beyond that partnership, the general education teacher has to stay the entire meeting. So you can't leave. You can't say, oh, I filled out this form, so now I'm not coming. There has to be an actual body in that meeting, the entirety of the meeting, to help that partnership and conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, not to throw anyone under the bus, but I've been in situations where meeting runs into the next class period, and I have a class, and so it's kind of like oh, well, you need to get to class. We're just finishing up here. You can leave. But yeah, I mean, there's certain federally obligated things that have to happen in this meeting. And I think if the teacher is able to stand up and say, no, I'm supposed to be here the entire time, that's generally good. It's going to be good for the students. It's going to be good for the process. It's going to be good to make sure that everything happens the way it's supposed to happen.
Absolutely. The last piece, just kind of going back to the previous question before this too, of like the role of teachers in the ARD meeting, is what do I do with the paperwork afterwards? So you want to keep documentation of how you're implementing the kid's IEP. And so at the end of the year, yes, teachers, we want to shred things because there's not going to be your student and you're not going to have any legal need to know about that kiddo anymore. But as general education teachers, something to keep in mind is a parent can come back and say up to 2 years after they were in your class that they're mad about something that happened that IEP year. And it could be something that happened in your class. Like you didn't give them the accommodations. So you want to keep that documentation of the accommodations for up to 3 years after that kid leaves your class. And so it is important to talk to your special education counterparts and the case manager for that student of how do we keep this documentation. Often that falls to the burden of the special education teacher, so they're going to come and ask for it and then just tell you, hey, if you've printed any copies of goals or accommodations, just shred that. But if you've documented along the year that you were providing these accommodations, you want to make sure that where that documentation goes for the special education team. So should a parent get mad later on down the line in that kid's educational career, you can be protected in knowing that you did what you were supposed to and you have evidence of it. Because the one thing that everyone needs to know about special education and education in general is you can say whatever you want, but it is just an opinion unless it's written down and you have the data to back your decision.
Right. Data tells the story, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I want to go back to one other thing you talked about with the ARD meeting and that how you represent kind of all of gen ed. And at the high school level, of course, the students have 6, 8 other classes, 7 other classes than you. I know in my experience, typically what happens is that they collect information from the other teachers who aren't going to be, and really every teacher. So you would put in a statement as well, and that gets reviewed during the ARD meeting. So like, Dr. So-and-so said this about the student in their math class, and, this person over here says he's doing this in band, right? I mean, so that gets reviewed. You are representing all of the general education teachers, but they do get information from those classes to help drive conversations, right?
Absolutely.
Yes. I think, and if I can jump in on the gen ed side, right, sometimes it is hard to keep up with all the requests for information, especially if you have a lot of general education students in the classroom. But I know from personal experience that is important, right? It's an important piece of it, and you got to fill out every form that they send, every document that they ask you to fill out, because it's all for the betterment of the student, right?
Absolutely. And it's that data trail. Again, if it's not written down, we can't prove we looked at that piece of data when we were making any decision. So it's often dotting the I's and crossing the T's with those forms of paperwork. So they may seem tedious, and we try from the special education perspective, both on the evaluation and teacher side of when we're developing and collecting that data, not to inundate you. But if we know the kid really struggles in math or science and they're rocking it out in English, we're going to press for that paperwork, because we need to be able to say the kid is doing awesome over here, but they're struggling in this area of the content or this area, this type of subject matter, so that we can drive that IEP to focus on those areas of weakness, but also help the kids shine in the strengths, because it's hard to sit in a meeting from a parent side of it and have everyone just slam the negative of your kid can't do this, your kid can't do that. And so we're asking for that feedback across all of those subjects so that we have those strengths to allow the kid to shine, which comes even more important at the secondary level, because those kids are often in the meeting and you don't want to hear, you can't do, you're not doing, you're terrible at this, without any of those positives. So we want to try to keep those meetings and the data as comprehensive of that student and as reflective of what those strengths are, as well as those areas of concern, so that we're moving the student forward and giving that student the positives that they can shine about.
Yeah, that's really a good point. I mean, my experience, all the students have always been in the meetings, right? I mean, that doesn't happen in the lower grade levels, but it gets to a point where the student becomes an active part of this meeting. So you certainly don't want to be sitting there slamming the student when they're in the room. But it's also an important opportunity to build up the student and say, you are doing very well in this, this, and this. And the student is a part of the conversation, right? I feel that I'm doing well here because, or I feel like I'm not doing well over here because, and they become an active member of those decision-making processes. With all of this stuff that we've been talking about, right, it seems like we're just piling more stuff onto the general education teacher, fill out these forms, track this data, have a tracking system. So the next question is about support. Like what sort of help can a general education teacher expect throughout the year to best meet the needs of their students?
The first thing the gen ed teachers really need to focus on is building and understanding the relationship that their special education teacher and counterparts have for that student. Again, special education is that intensive support that offers more than what the general education teacher can give. So you get the IEP, but with that comes access to professionals to help support and help you manage that. So in the classroom, you may have inclusion support. So somebody coming into that room and helping support that student. It may be multiple students. It may be half your class. Whatever is happening in your classroom, because it's going to vary. Sometimes class periods, sometimes district to district. It looks very different. But your special education team can really help you understand what that accommodation looks like and how can you globally meet that need. Because a lot of what you're going to do is universal design and universal teaching practices. It just has to be tailored a little bit different, or you have to make sure that you have an emphasis with that student. So when you're giving directions, it may be as simple as you're giving direct eye contact to specific students. So you're not changing anything that you're doing, but you're checking in with that student, making sure they're focused and on what you're asking them to do.
Gotcha. So like what's good for one student is going to be good for the entire class, but the special education student still needs to have that individualized sort of check-in, right? Or whatever it is that needs to be meeting those goals.
Absolutely. Yeah. So having that conversation when you get those and review those plans with your special education teachers are helpful, because they help give you those tips and tricks of like, these kids, this accommodation looks like this for them versus this accommodation that may be slightly worded a little bit different looks like something different. And the easiest one to think of is reading support. Often, because we have such a high level of students identified with dyslexia and difficulties with reading comprehension, the use of oral administration or use of reading support is going to cover about 90% of your kids in special education for a plethora of reasons. But you have to be able to read that accommodation and know, is it only on student request when they're getting reading assistance? Is it the entirety of the questions and answers that are always being read to the student, or something different? And so being able to focus in on what those words are, of some at student request versus auto or automatic, those all mean something different. And so asking those questions ahead of time is going to help you support your student best.
And specifically with math and science, and I would imagine it happens in social studies and English too, in a lot of cases, pictures, graphs, images, do you read those? Do you describe those? I know what gets covered underneath these accommodations. That's an important question to have. I know whenever I was teaching in Frisco, whenever I had a student who was really kind of the most complicated one that I had, and it was more on the behavior side more than the academic side, but I essentially said, I don't know what to do. Can you please help me? And I was, 10 years into the profession. And so I had a meeting with several special education teachers and say, what am I doing? What can I do? What does this look like? So this is not a new teacher sort of thing. This is like, when you encounter something new, go to your teachers.
Absolutely. I mean, all special education teachers, again, is K through 12. But the bulk of our background and understanding in a college career is how to take learning and adapt it. What changes? How do we modify? How do we accommodate that? But keep the integrity of the content. That's what our jobs and that's what allows us to become a special education teacher is how are we adapting? What are we changing or tweaking for the student? Oftentimes your secondary special education teacher will also have a content specific. So they may have an English content class, so they may be higher level in that, or they may have a science or math. They may not know your content as well, but they have some content knowledge. And so, but again, our job as special education is how do we keep the integrity of the content but adapt it? And so the tips and tricks of how to change that is going to come from your special education teachers. And then you have your inclusion paraprofessionals that come into the classroom that help support, that are trained by your teachers of like, this is what this accommodation always needs to look like for this kid. And so they can actually take things in your classroom where they're noticing a particular kid or group of kids is really struggling with the vocabulary or understanding this graphic, and being able to go in the moment of like, let me rephrase this for that group of student, let me show them a little bit differently so that they take that information and get what you want them to from the lesson without, again, destroying the content or the integrity of the lesson, and keeping things moving in that classroom.
Yes, the point is not watering it down, just making it accessible.
Absolutely. So your inclusion supports, most of them look like a small group instruction. You have an extra teacher that's in the classroom doing spot checks of task demands, ensuring that your accommodations are happening, and they do a lot of monitoring the use of those accommodations to help make sure that the kid is accessing that curriculum or that content or that task demand so that they can be successful in it, and helping that kid adapt in the meantime.
So it's a lot of the tracking that we talked about earlier. So they're responsible
they're responsible for doing that, and we'll track a lot of it. So it helps you as a classroom teacher be able to focus on teaching and leave that demand to someone else. As a teacher, you're tracking mainly the test and your assignments that are graded. You're going to be noting on there, did they have oral? If they have inclusion support or someone that's in that room that's helping, they're going to make those notes for you too. So then they just give you that data collection, or it goes back to the special education case manager.
Right. So how is inclusion teachers different from co-teachers?
So a co-teacher would be a special education teacher, oftentimes who has content level knowledge of the content that they are supporting. So they can actually take on more of that instructional role to allow you as that teacher to maybe pull small groups and do some reteach and intervention or with your lower level students, and allow the teacher to kind of take that on and give more of the content and actually teach the whole group. Whereas inclusion support doesn't always have to have the teacher actually teaching the whole class. So it's a little bit different. Each district that across the state of Texas will have their own guidelines of whether they are a co-teach model district or if they are an inclusion only district, or kind of what that looks like. But your special education teachers knows what that look like. And oftentimes your campus principals and you as the classroom teacher and special education teacher, if there's a teacher who is knowledgeable and wants to help and you want to do co-teaching, they'll allow you to kind of make that classroom what you need to meet the kids' demands, especially if you have if you're in a district or on a campus that you have one class that's a lot of high needs, that inclusion support's going to innately look different than a class that doesn't have high needs, because you have less things going into that IEP. The more intensive supports you have, the more desire you're going to need to lean more to a co-teach, where the teacher is taking down all of the content to a different level to meet the middle level student of your class.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so a general education teacher should really be focusing on utilizing all of the supports that they have, whether that's supports outside the class, supports within the class, right? I mean, if you have these students in your classroom, I'll be honest, general education teachers, they only get that one course, right? We don't get the level of knowledge necessary to adequately support these students in a lot of cases. So utilizing the supports is going to be our job. That's our job to make sure the student gets what they need. And if that means bringing other people to the table, then that's what we do.
Absolutely.
Is there anywhere specific a general education teacher can go to find more resources to help them accommodate, modify, or just work with students with special needs in the classroom?
Absolutely. So the first place I would tell you to look is what your district's policy is for response to intervention, or RTI, or if they are a district that uses MTSS, which is a multi-tiered system of support for students. Basically, those are the levels of interventions and things that the general education teachers are doing to support the student by providing something in addition to what they are giving every student in that classroom. So what interventions? The key difference between an RTI district and an MTSS district is that MTSS also focuses on functional and behavioral support needs, whereas an RTI model district only focuses on the academic. They may have interventions for behavior, but they're not as globally tracked as an MTSS district. So each district has their own policies and procedures out there that kind of go through what the district considers as their golden standard. And so know where to find that procedural manual and kind of how to go through that. Oftentimes they're broken up into elementary, middle, and secondary campuses of what you can do and kind of quick, easy fixes and print-offs that you can use to help track data while you're collecting it for that student.
Nice.
TEA, or the Texas Education Agency, has a lot of information on their special education site and guidance. So they actually have a sped tech site where it has things that are good for general education teachers and special education teachers alike, but it really helps you understand what goes from the evaluation side all the way into class interventions, and again, some data tracking sheets and examples that the state's kind of put out just to help support our state across the district. In general, just some other websites that you can go to is Intervention Central, which is just a plethora of things to do differently for kids. And it ranges from academics to behavioral supports in the classroom. And then positive intervention and supports for behavior is also a good website.
Awesome. So I'll try to include that with the posting of the podcast. That way everyone has access to that. And that is all the time that we have today. Thank you, Catherine, for being a guest today. The Aggie Teach Momentum podcast drops every 2 weeks, so make sure that you are looking for the next episode on Spotify or linked on the Aggie Teach Arts and Sciences website. For more information, you can visit our program website at aggieteachartsci.tamu.edu. That is aggieteach, ARTSCI.tamu.edu. Thanks and gig 'em.